Hey everybody, all right. I think we're getting started here. Yeah, there we go. So this is the chapter 11 video, at least part one of it. And chapter 11 discusses the two big problems in economics, the two things that economists worry about regarding the economy, which are inflation and unemployment. So before we start, a few reminders down at the bottom. It is important, I think, to realize that critical thinking 3 and 4 are both due on the same date. That's not really ideal, but in an effort to get you through enough material to write those and wrap up the class when we need to wrap up the class, I kind of had to do that. So hopefully you've written one of the earlier papers and you don't have to do both of those, but if you do, they are both due on the 14th and earlier if you wanted a chance to redo them. A couple other due dates there, but you can read those for yourself. Okay, so like I said, inflation and unemployment are kind of the two big problems that economists worry about. The economists who sort of manage the work for the government and try to manage the economy. These are sort of the two key targets that they're always looking at and thinking about. So you probably know what they are. Inflation just refers to an average overall increase in the price level. And that usually occurs when the economy is growing and doing well. Basically, that happens because when the economy is growing, it's because people are feeling good, they're earning money, they're going out there spending money, they're trying to buy things, and sometimes businesses can't produce things quickly enough. They can't produce enough to keep up with demand, and in that case, there tend to be shortages, which puts upward pressure on prices. The other problem, of course, is unemployment. Unemployment is when people who want to work can't find jobs or lose their jobs. So it specifically refers to people who actually want to work, because there are some people who don't want or need to work, but that's what unemployment is. This usually happens during recession. So we have these two different problems. Inflation tends to happen when the economy is doing well. Unemployment tends to happen when the economy is doing poorly. That inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment is something that economists call the Phillips curve. So there's a lot of talk and some graphs and discussion of that in the book, but the Phillips curve basically says that there's kind of this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. When inflation is going up, unemployment tends to be going down, and vice versa. So that's the Phillips curve. So here's a graphical depiction of that. Again, as inflation goes up, unemployment goes down, and vice versa. This was kind of discovered back in the 50s or 60s by an economist named Phillips, as you might imagine, and thought to be true for a while. It seemed like it was true. But then they had some weird times in the 70s and 80s where there were exceptions. So then they kind of began to question, does the Phillips curve relationship really hold? And I think most of the time it probably is still true. Most of the time when inflation is going up, unemployment is going down, and vice versa. But occasionally there are these odd shocks, things that happen like an oil embargo. That's what happened in the 70s that caused different things. But, in most cases, I think this relationship is still true, and it kind of helps policymakers to be aware of that, because they have to understand that, hey, if we're trying to tamp down inflation, we don't want to go too far, because then you run a risk of increasing unemployment. So that's why those things are important. But now the thinking has evolved a little bit. Instead of just kind of assuming the very simple idea of the Phillips curve, which I think is still generally true, it's been discovered that the economy really kind of works more in phases. So you very commonly will have a Phillips phase. Phillips phase will happen when an economy is growing and you have rising inflation due to increasing demand and shortages, and falling unemployment because businesses are trying to hire as many workers as they can to increase their production. So that part should make sense. Sometimes, though, you get to a stagflation phase. So stagflation means the economy is stagnating, it's stagnant, but you still have inflation. So in this case, you will have rising unemployment, and also high or rising inflation. So that's kind of the worst case scenario. People are losing their jobs and prices are going up. That's pretty bad. Then hopefully we get at some point to a recovery phase in which both inflation and unemployment begin to decrease again. So and then eventually we probably move back into another Phillips phase. So that's another view of things, is that the Phillips curve is a little too simplistic, and maybe we go through phases like this. So that's probably more accurate. Now we want to relate these to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So in the Phillips phase, sort of cut that off, sorry, I think I'm in the way. You can't quite see all of that graph on the right, but you move from point 1 to 2 to 3, going right to left. And as you're going right to left, inflation is going up and unemployment is going down. The graph on the left shows you why that's happening in terms of aggregate supply and demand, and it's basically happening because aggregate demand is increasing. So people and businesses are feeling good, they're spending money, they're buying things. That pushes aggregate demand to the right and puts upward pressure on the price level. Then, if we get to a stagflation phase, that tends to look like this. We're moving from point 3 to point 4 now. And what's happened at that point typically is that inflation, a lot of times inflation starts off on consumer goods, the things that we're trying to buy as consumers increase, but eventually it carries over to everything in the economy. So people want higher wages to compensate for the higher prices, cost of inputs to businesses increase, and so as the cost of production increases, that shifts aggregate supply. So your short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, moving us from point 3 to point 4. So then you have still upward pressure on prices, but decreasing real GDP, and therefore people losing their jobs and unemployment starts increasing. So that's the story with the stagflation phase. Finally, in a recovery phase, once kind of wages and prices and things have adjusted somewhat, people can start spending again. It's tough to tell. A lot of times the recovery phase happens due to some government assistance. The government will come in and either start spending money or undertaking policies to put money back into people's hands to encourage spending. So if they do that, something like the TARP, some of the things that were done during the last recession, put money into people's hands and allowed them to start spending again. That shifts aggregate demand back to the right, and prices start going up a little bit more, but although hopefully slower. But the important part is unemployment starts to decline as the economy improves. So that's how we often work through those phases. Okay, last topic is the equation of exchange. I'm going to stop the video here and make a part 2 and talk about that in a separate video. So this is a good stopping point for now. So I'll sign off and make another video in a few minutes.